So, to an extent, this video is going to seem a little repetitive. And let me explain why. Because I have covered quite a chunk of this topic before from one perspective. You see, these ships all owe their starting points to World War I. They're all, to an extent, ingratiated in World War I, which is why I cover them all when I was talking about the Age of Furious, when I was going through that video, and there will be a point at which I'll get to a link. I'll get to in this video where I'll go. There's a link above. If you want to go watch that before continuing on, I completely understand. You don't have to watch it. They're standalone videos, but it will give you context of why I'm emphasizing certain things and covering other things in this video. But realistically, this video, Conception, Operation and Conclusion of HMS Hermes, Hōshō and Langley, is about the peacetime, the post-World War I navies, the immediate post-war environment, and what they're envisaging for their naval aviation. Because I'm going to do key ships on each of these ships. I will do. They deserve it. They deserve their own key ships, which is going to look into them and look into their individual life histories. But the broader discussion of them, the context of them, the comparisons of them, that needs to go somewhere. And yeah, they are small ships which get barely any attention. One of these has been converted to a seaplane carrier by World War II, or sort of return. Well, she started as a collier and then is converted to a seaplane carrier. One actually survives World War II, but is a training ship for most of the years, and so is pretty much forgotten for most of the war, which might be one of the reasons why she survives. And the other one, her death is often treated almost as a punchline. The amount of times I hear, well, you know, you only have to look at the death of HMS Hermes to understand the Royal Navy really didn't understand naval aviation. They didn't understand its value. They didn't understand what it was for. To just get really, really annoyed. Because it's not. It's really not. Hermes' loss is really, really problematic for the British in many, many ways. No, she's no longer a first-line asset. But to be honest, she'd never been employed as a first-line asset. That hadn't been the reason in many ways for the continuing creation of her. Even when she was being constructed, they had decided already she could not carry a large enough air group for them to do what they wanted to do as a strike carrier, as a fleet carrier. But they still built her, because they still had a role in mind for her. And in that role, she was actually incredibly useful. And served well through the 1920s, 1930s, and World War II. All these ships show their own nation's appreciation of naval aviation and where they think it's going to go at the beginning of the 1920s. When they're still basking in the experience of World War I, the lessons learned, the very jointness of the development of naval aviation in that period, and the fact that they are all feeding off pretty much the same data. And this is the starting point of the divergence. It's their approach to the carriers in this scenario. Because if you consider, and well, compare and contrast the wartime ideas of developing carriers, things like Furious, things like Eagle, etc., for the British, and even things like Hōshō and Langley eventually, they're all coming from a very similar basis. They're all coming from a very similar idea of what their carriers are going to be for. Hermes is the first divergence. Hermes is a divergence in many, many regards from that line, and kind of gives a nice idea of why the navies start to develop differently. And the first thing I want to really say before we get into that too far is you have to get away from the idea of there being a right way to develop naval aviation and a wrong way, in terms of a universal one-size-fits-all right way and a universal one-size-fits-all wrong way, or rather any way which isn't X way must be wrong. Because every country has its own issues. Every country has its own unique, to use the phraseology which is loved most often today, geostrategic situation and scenario. Every country therefore needs to adapt to face that scenario as best it can. And sometimes going with what is the best route for one country would be absolutely the worst thing for you. Now, I would say this particular issue is compounded greatly by the treaties of the interwar years, which do seek to implement a one-size-fits-all straitjacket of solutions, or rather, limitation on outcomes on all navies. That is a problem. Does it necessarily stop innovation and stop them developing navies to suit them? No, it doesn't. But it does mean they're always having to make a lot more compromises and a lot more value judgments than they necessarily would like to. For example, I don't think the Royal Navy realised when they were selecting the class they were for the Hawkins that they were going to be defining cruisers for the next 30 years. They really didn't realise that was going to be the impact of their decision to go with a 7.5-inch light large cruiser rather than going with a 9.2-inch gunned heavy cruiser. I really don't think any of the designers were thinking that through, or thinking that far ahead, or that was a possibility, because I'm fairly certain if they had been, they'd have gone with the bigger ship. Because it gives you more freedom to maneuver over the next 20-30 years. With these carriers, many of their starting points are prior to the end of the war. Certainly prior to the Washington Naval Treaty. And all of them are starting points. Okay, Hermes and Hōshō are brand new constructions. And Langley is a conversion. In fact, Langley, Lexington, Saratoga, they're all conversions. The US don't get to building their own from the keel up brand new carrier till they get to USS Ranger. Which is both an advantage and a disadvantage. It gives them a lot of time to work out what they want from a carrier before they start building a brand new carrier. But it also leads to issues with what they think they can get out of a purpose-built carrier. The most important thing that has to be understood with all this and all discussion that's going to take place is naval aviation is not a mature product at this point. Naval aviation is not anywhere near a mature product. To say they are just doing the first point of sticking their tippy toes in the ocean of knowledge that will be required to actually function, let alone soar in terms of naval aviation at the period they're designing these ships, is to underestimate it grossly. So, these ships need to be treated in that context. They need to be considered both the first steps and also the first searches for information. With all the advantages and pitfalls that come with that. Sadly, there are more pitfalls than there are advantages with being the first generation of anything. There are far more problems that you can lumber into than there are scenarios you can survive, thanks to being the first. Shameless book plug. Now, I always have this in all of my videos. There is a reason Thank you everyone who likes, shares and subscribes to videos. Thank you to everyone who engages with the channel and helps it grow. I'm an academic. That is my background, that is what I am. When I'm not in the process of moving house, which seems to grow more complicated and involve more lawyers and more bankers and more everyone every single day, and more people asking for me for money every single day, I am a university lecturer. Usually a contract lecturer. I have considered full-time posts, but I've applied for them, never got one. They usually call me back for a contract though, so I can't obviously do too badly in interviews. But leaving that to one side, academics are in the UK and most countries of the world are selected on merits of publish or perish. How well your books publish and how well they circulate, and same with journal articles. The thing is, YouTube videos don't count. So both me and Sal Mercanago of What's Going On with Shipping have the same problem. If we want to be promoted academically in universities, if we want to, in his case, go for a more senior role, in my case, go for an actual permanent role, I need to be publishing books, because I can go look at my YouTube channel and they'll go, nice, we have no metrics to establish that. How's your book doing? So, in every single video, I do a shameless book plug. And when there are more books out, I will add more books to the roster of my shameless book plug. So I'll be a shameless books plug. Or shameless book plugs. That can be today's first question. Should it be, when it's multiple books, is it shameless books plug? Or shameless book plugs? Which do we think it should be when there's multiple books out? And second question, due to the entirely the moving thing, and I realise this is off topic, but hopefully at this point I have a fair number of you still watching. I'm thinking of holding what I'm terming a packing party, whereby I get a lot of friends around, and in return for me providing pizza, soft drinks, and desserts, and snacks, they help me pack up the house, because it seems to be more and more stuff keeps going on boxes, and I keep finding even more stuff that needs to go on boxes, and I'm worried about the moving date approaching, us not getting it all packed. Do you think A, that's viable, and B, is pizza or snacks and desserts enough, or do I have to actually do more than that? I'd just like some ideas from people below, please. This is not today's question. I always do a question at the end of the videos, but those two questions, shameless book plugs or shameless books plugs, books plug, I'm not sure, and the exact definitions of requirements for a pizza packing party or something. What should I be providing? I'd like ideas. I can understand why people don't move house that often if they have a choice, because frankly, I think after this, what I'm going to do in future is, if I have to move, I'm selling the property as is with all the stuff in it, just packing up the books and moving. They can keep all the rest of the stuff, just taking the books with me. It'll be easier. So here's the point at which I'm going to point out, the Furious stage. Now, if you've seen this video, you'll know I talked through all the discussions and how Furious's evolution really does show the evolution of thinking in terms of aircraft carriers. It shows the approach of how we start off with spotting aircraft / reconnaissance aircraft and moving on to strike aircraft and a wider air group. And the link to the video should be up there right about now. That is all a really interesting area to go. But the thing is, this is all done, well, quite a lot of it in Furious's case is done under the crush of World War I, with that bearing down on it, the urgency, the need, we need this now. We want to strike the Kaiserliche Marine in Wilhelmshaven now. We want to do this now. It's all about doing it now. And the reality is, once the war's over, you can take some time to step back from that whole mountain. You can take time to think through. Yes, the money drops down in terms of your access to funds. And yes, you are having to deal with demobilization and getting rid of a load of old ships and all the other problems. But more importantly, you can take time to think things through and truly develop things. With that all said, though, where should we start? Well, I think if we're looking at this new generation of aviation coming in post World War One, the Navy's emerging and trying to factor in this wholly new area, this wholly new concept in so many ways that they've never had access to before. Yes, people talk about airships and balloons, but let's be honest, there is a world of difference between operating an airship and operating a balloon. It's a very, very different scenario. So, let's start off with Langley. Now, this vessel, as I've said before, was named in honour of Samuel Pierpont Langley, who was an astronomer, physicist, aeronautics pioneer, and aircraft engineer. And she, of course, is CV-1. She is the original American carrier. And, well, she's an interesting vessel. Article 8 of the Washington Naval Treaty provides an exemption for experimental aircraft carriers to be replaced whenever their nation needs to, as long as they are in existence or building on the 12th of November 1921. So anything which existed prior to then can be replaced whenever you want. Anything that's building prior to then can be replaced whenever you want. Now, I would say the Navy which has the most advantage from this is the Royal Navy, because you've got Eagle, you have got Furious, you have got Hermes, you have got Argus. To be honest, the Royal Navy could probably make a case for Courageous and Glorious. Enough that they could get what I call the Lexington pass, as long as it technically can be said to fit the rules, no one's going to question it too much, because it might reveal what other things they are technically breaking. For the Americans, they get Langley. For the Japanese, they get Hōshō. So it really is an article which benefits the Royal Navy. Now, the Royal Navy doesn't take much of an advantage of this, because it's always trying to grow its fleet. And we'll get into that in a second. But for the Americans, starting off with the Langley was very much about starting off small. Learning to walk before you ran. There's a great picture on this screen, which is Langley with Lexington and Saratoga. Both of them looked like they could eat Langley for breakfast and still have space for a hearty lunch and dinner made up of standard battleships. They are truly colossal in comparison to her size. Yet she's the starting point. She's the starting point for a lot of ideas and technologies which are featured in them. She's the starting point for a lot of the American growth of naval aviation. And she does this through her air group. Now, her air group is interesting. And that really shows what they're getting her for. Because, and again, these are aircraft which are going to have key aircraft series videos, so I'm not going to go into huge details individually about them. Douglas DT torpedo bomber and the Vought V7 Bluebird fighter. So you've got a strike aircraft and a fighter. Strike aircraft and a fighter. Torpedo bomber, the reliable unit. After all, torpedo bomber seaplanes had been used by navies throughout World War I and had caused some losses. And the Royal Navy had been really pushing development of the Sopwith Cuckoo, a torpedo bomber. And that had been a driving focus behind the development of HMS Furious. So, what is she about? She's about the US Navy seeking teeth. She's about the US Navy growing into itself, but also it growing into its perception of what it needs to do. It doesn't get the funding it needs to do it, really. It's always scrabbling for more funds. It's always having to fight for its very existence. Yes, there is a strong isolationist bent in the American political psyche, although that isolationist bent seems to be, how do I put it, subjective. At the height of their isolationism, they're still doing things in the Far East. Yes, they don't want to get involved in European wars, but they're happily going out and provoking the Japanese. Those things run side by side. To an extent, the Americans embody their Go West philosophy. Go West. Going East, that's Europe. That's the old lands. That's the old world. That's not where they're going. It's going west. One of the really interesting things I often get into when I'm discussing the development of American naval aviation and their growth and thinking about it is that so much of it is focused on operating in the Pacific. Langley's a really good example of this. Because you would expect an aircraft carrier which is converted from a collier, a fast collier, called a Proteus class called Jupiter, in Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Portsmouth, Virginia, to be built with, honestly, the realities of operating in the Atlantic more in mind. Look at those open sides. Look at that open hangar. Think about what's going to happen to aircraft in those scenarios, in those facilities. The aircraft of this period are not that great. You know, the good example is the fact that of the Douglas DT, probably one of the most interesting design histories of torpedo bombers in this period, aircraft which potentially were used by the Norwegians to attack the Germans when Germany decided to invade them. There's a whole debate and discussion about whether or not any of them got off and whether or not any of them actually launched an attack. It's certainly something worth investigating and something I would love to spend a lot more time looking into. My suspicion is that even if they did, the Norwegians themselves, considering how they are occupied afterwards, would have made sure the records disappeared for fear of retribution. And it's very easy to fudge records in that kind of scenario. But leaving that to one side, none of them survive. Especially the Americans. 90 of these aircraft were built, not a single one survives. They rotted away. They have disappeared from the world. And that's a sad, sad thing. That truly is a sad thing. And don't get me started on the Vought V7 Bluebirds. These aircraft are their strike capability. They're their core capability for that. What do I mean by this? Well, whilst Lexington and Saratoga immediately go to the reconnaissance force, immediately go to the reconnaissance fleet, and the scouting fleet, and immediately sort of become the core of that, and they do that very well. Whilst I wish they had some of their battle cruiser sisters along with them, I really do think the US Navy needed some of those. I wish the treaties had worked out in a way that you had Lexington class both in carrier form and battle cruiser form, because I think those matchups would have been truly, truly capable forces. I also think under such circumstances, someone would have gone, why are we sticking 8-inch guns up this high in the ship? Isn't that going to create top weight issues and all the things are supporting them? And under what circumstances do we really want this massive, fragile target to be engaging in 8-inch gunfire? I mean, even if she has the guns to fire at them, she has to then maneuver so she can fire at them. Do you want her doing that? Or do you want her launching aircraft and trying to keep as far away from them as possible? And maybe if we save that weight from those guns, we can put that weight into either armor or maybe supporting more aircraft so we can launch and recover more quickly, or there are all sorts of options, really. No, that would have been a tremendous benefit, but also I think that, honestly, for the Americans and for the kind of war they actually ended up fighting, those teams would have been absolute killers. But that's not the kind of war the Americans are preparing for in the 1920s. And you can see this with Langley and her first exercises. Some of her first exercises involved taking out her fighters, her Bluebirds, her DTs, those torpedo bombers, and attacking the battle line and just seeing what happens. The Americans are still very sure, and let's be honest, in 1920 they are very much correct, that the battle line is it. But they run exercises, including one which I really do love. It's an exercise where they literally take their battleships out, their latest, newest standard battleships, and they operate together, but they have no escorts, they have no other covering fire, and they just attack them with torpedo bombers. And they just try and see what gets sunk, what happens. And they do a really good job of it. And yes, this exercise is completely, utterly unrealistic. Because there is no scenario you should have your battleships in such a situation where they can barely fire back, no escorts, and under attack by aircraft. Yeah, the Force Z would like a word with everyone, please, at this point, but we'll leave that to one side. We'll get on to the Royal Navy, and they do realise that shouldn't be happening, but life happens, and history doesn't give a hoot. And they do this because this is kind of the worst case scenario, and they want to see what the result is. And all that, they're supposed to be aiming for Arkansas, and she gets 8 hits. And instead of fudging it, instead of going, oh, well, you know, we shouldn't learn from this because it's not a good example of history and all these things, they go, no, it's not a good example of what's likely to happen, but we still can learn lessons from this. Our battleships cannot maneuver fast enough to avoid what is, in many ways, a sped-up destroyer attack. That's where it's coming from. This is a sped-up destroyer attack. They cannot maneuver fast enough to really dodge it. She's got hit by 8 out of 18. And some of them, when some of those torpedoes went and hit other battleships in the formation. We need to think this through. We need to have plans in place to prevent that ever happening. Because that's what this scenario does. It shows you, hang on, all those ideas you have about how great and how survivable your battleships are, can they really survive being hit by 8 torpedoes? Think about that. Next time you are running a simulation, or if you're doing a computer game and you've got this computer scenario and the battleship is duking out all those hits and carrying on, the real world doesn't have that status bar which is dropping down. You get hit by those torpedoes, you're gone. Sometimes it can be one torpedo in the wrong place. Or the right place, depending on your perspective. For the Americans, that's the point at which they really start to realize that their aviation needs to develop. But what does their aviation need to develop into? This is what leads to some of the ideas which go into the big exercises they have in the interwar years, the really big developments of their naval aviation. And those exercises are what grow the fleet. Those exercises, though, come from these first experiences which are due to Langley, and her wandering around proving to be both good and bad. proving to both have a good design and be able to support these fighters, to support these strikes, run these operations, and also not providing enough. Because the Americans quickly work out, right, so we need to get through to the point at which we can guarantee getting this many aircraft to attack this target. Okay, so if we're going to have defences, we're going to have to deal with to get through that. How many aircraft do we have to launch to get the required number of aircraft through to the target? And that starts to drive their carrier air wing size. And the Americans are also thinking about the world from their perspective. And that helps them, because they can concentrate on carrier air group size. They can concentrate on that, because that's the metric in their geostrategic situation. That's the option. They have space to maneuver, and more importantly, their likely combat areas, whether the Pacific or the Atlantic, they have coasts on them. They have huge ports and naval infrastructure. They have huge facilities for constructing ships that they can build, or they actually have in existence. And therefore, for them, the realities of war are, we can build it. Even this period, they're sort of getting that idea. They don't have the funding to build it, when they have the idea, they can. And in December of the same year, because Langley comes out in March. Langley, she is recommissioned in March 1922. Hōshō, she comes out in December 1922. And there's immediately a difference. The Japanese have been planning to build two seaplane carriers. Shokaku, her sister, and Hōshō. But they saw Hermes being built. They were getting information back from Furious, from the operations with Argus, from the experience of HMS Campania. Their observers were heavily involved in the war fighting, in the World War I experience. And that meant they decided to change their mind and went, no, we don't want a seaplane carrier. We want a fleet carrier. We want an aircraft carrier. And what's really interesting about this vessel? She's 7,600 tons in standard. She's 7,600 tons in standard, and she carries 15 aircraft. If we go all the way through the Japanese conversions to the very next of their builds, the Ryūshō, they try and put something 8,000 tons standard. They try and stick 48 aircraft on her as they build her. And that is, of course, famously unstable and famously doesn't work. It's a whole saga. But then we get to Soryu. And Soryu is 16,200 tons in standard. That's a little bit over twice the displacement. And she carries 63 aircraft plus 9 reserve airframes. If you're thinking, Alex, that's nearly 5 times the aircraft total of Hōshō, and it's only twice the displacement in standard, you would be correct. And it shows the true metric of an aircraft carrier. As you scale it up and make it bigger and bigger and bigger, it gets more efficient. You can carry far more aircraft per ton the larger the carrier grows. There's also a factor of experience in that, in development. In all of that, there is factors of experience and development. But Hōshō is the beginning point. That's why I forgive the fact they take a perfectly sensible island structure and turn it into a flush deck. I accept that. I don't agree with it. I think it's absurd. I really do not like flush deck designs. But the reason I don't like flush deck designs is because I have read far too many accident reports from the early days of naval aviation and the problems that come with having a flush deck in terms of being able to judge the height above the deck when you're landing. If we go back to this earlier picture of Langley, is it there? No, it's this one, yeah. And from the Bluebird, you can see the deck landing officer directing in the aircraft. You can also see a net placed over the stern of the carrier. A net. Now, if you're dealing with aircraft that are at that speed, that they can be caught in a net, and that is actually a survivable chance. Think about how many accidents took place, but also, here's the really scary thing. You are more likely to die in an accident where you crash into the deck than if you land on the sea with aircraft of the first generation due to the speed they're going. Yes, there's always the chance that in really bad waves your aircraft can flip over and the pilot can be flung from the aircraft. And that can be a traumatic experience. But the thing about the flush deck, and they did keep it, they've developed systems to try to make it better, and as aircraft got faster, and there was more of a thump landing, and various things are added to modify the carriers to make it work, it becomes safer. But the reason Langley has that net, the thing that kills pilots, more often than not, is judging the height to be lower than it actually is. And crashing into the actual flight deck. If you judge it to be higher than it is, the worst that happens is you fly over the carrier. If you judge it lower than it is, you can lose your wheels and go smashing onto the deck with your propellers, spinning away, and they will spin off erratically and who knows where they go. The engine might be shunted back by the force of the impact, which means it goes straight into the pilot. Luckily, not too many accidents happened in the early days. Enough they learnt the lessons, and lessons were paid for. But not so many it put anyone off naval aviation. In the case of Hōshō, her early air groups were the Mitsubishi B1M Type 13 torpedo bomber, which is another cute aircraft. You might be noticing something of a similarity coming about with these torpedo bombers. They do look like they are literally flying trucks. Everything is about a big engine and the ability to carry the torpedo. That's all you care about. Look, speed... And the Mitsubishi B1M has a fairly long career because it's a stable, reliable aircraft. And honestly, aircraft development in this period depends a lot upon engine development. It depends a lot on growing engines and growing the capability of engines and the power density of engines. And that is, for many years, very incremental as engines develop. And then eventually you order a new aircraft because you're ordering the new variant of the engine. That's what changes. The fighters it carried, well, the Mitsubishi 1MF wasn't actually the first fighter it had from it. First fighter was the Gloucester Sparrowhawk, which, as it kind of sounds, was imported from Britain. And even The Mitsubishi 1MF, well, that's design history is basically Sopwith has shut down in the UK, and a guy called Herbert Smith, who's a very good aviation designer, basically brings Jack Hyland and a team of 6 other very skilled engineers from the UK to work with Mitsubishi and help them in setting up their fighter development arm. Now, the 1MF, how do I put this politely? It is a true Japanese, we want to develop our own infrastructure, we know this is our weakness, we're going to develop it our own way. They have got a claw type arrestor gear, which was used with the British arrestor systems, because the British have longitudinal rather than latitudinal, not across deck, lengthwise deck arrestor cables. Now, the interesting thing about that system being tried on British carriers is because the British are worried about the aircraft going over the side of the decks. That system is not really about stopping the aircraft. Believe it or not, they normally stop themselves, and if they don't, you reach out a hand and go, ah, good, you've stopped. And that's what parts of the deck crew were. So when you're on a modern aircraft carrier deck, and you are thinking this is all very difficult and arduous, it is. But you can at least be happy that today you aren't expected to stop aircraft by grabbing them with your bare hands. They only started getting gloves later on because at first they were worried that if they had the gloves, they might damage the fabric of the aircraft. So they were less worried about the hands of their sailors than they were the fabric of the aircraft. And believe it or not, this is not a Royal Navy thing, it's not an IJN thing, it's a Universal Navy thing. The USN, they're all doing it. So, yeah, no one started going, oh, this is due to classism or, you know, their societies. No, they're all the same. The French, everyone. It's fun times. But this aircraft is the first time the Japanese have got their own fighter. And this is where it's kind of interesting, because it's comparing it to the Gloucester Sparrowhawk that you learn some of the differences and similarities of what they want. Because the Sparrowhawk speed was 125 miles per hour. And that's pretty fine as far as the Japanese are concerned. The speed's only dropped up to 132 miles an hour. The endurance for the Sparrowhawk was roughly 3 hours. The endurance for the 1MF is 2.5 hours. The service ceiling, well, that's where things start to really change, because the Sparrowhawks was roughly 17,000 feet. And the 1MF's is 23,000 feet. And time to altitude, well, they can both do them to an extent similarly, but of course, the 1MF is going a lot higher. And when we consider their engines, well, this is a 300 horsepower engine. The Sparrowhawk had a 230 horsepower engine. And this is not much heavier. In fact, its all-up weight is 2,822 pounds, or that's 1.28 tons, versus the Sparrowhawk's 2,165 pounds, or 982 kilograms, or 0.982 tons. It's not a massive difference going on here. And there is a reason for that. If you've ever worked with Mazda or Subaru, or you ever had one of them, one of the things you might realize between different generations of certain cars, they do a lot of effort, they put a lot of effort in keeping the power to weight ratio, that is, whether you want to call that kilowatts to kilograms or horsepower to pounds, the same. They really do work on that and maintaining that ratio. By the way, I have seen people do horsepower HP to kilograms as well, just to get another sort of figure. But here's the thing, between both the Sparrowhawk and the 1MF, the horsepower to pounds ratio is 0.11, and the power to mass of kilowatts to kilograms is 0.18. That's exactly the same between them. In simple terms, these are both as maneuverable as they can be designed to be. And realistically, this is the Japanese going, we're concentrating on building our infrastructure and knowledge, but we want to build something which is not going to be a disaster. And also we want to make it work. So if we keep the power to weight ratio the same, if we keep everything the same, we make it as simple a transition as possible, we will have a viable aircraft that will serve as a development point for our nascent industry and a nascent aviation capability. And that's what they're doing. In fact, both these aircraft are good examples of this, and this carrier is a great example of this because it's Japan's first foray into a full flight deck carrier, full-length aircraft carrier, and it is literally built from scratch. And this comes back to the 8-6 plan, it comes back to all sorts of war plans the Japanese have and ideas the Japanese have, but ultimately it comes back to the Japanese trying to square the circle of being in infrastructure terms, due to the geography of Japan, due to the nature of their empire and the nature of their scenario, relatively small amongst the major powers. Relatively small in terms of infrastructure capabilities. Far larger, far more capable than many other nations in the world. So you can't call them small per se. But compared to the other major powers, their peer threats, they are very small. And they are searching for a way to be able to punch above their weight, to use that overused phrase. And they have alighted upon aircraft already. Hōshō is the beginning of this. And it becomes more and more of a case the moment the treaties kick in. Because very quickly they learn to build an aircraft carrier industrially is a lot less complicated than building a battleship. That's probably going to get a lot of people upset with me, but let me explain. On an aircraft carrier, you're mostly dealing with things which can be easily moved or assembled inside. You don't have turrets. You don't have masses of armor plate which has to be produced to the required thickness and then transported around and mounted on. There are huge weights involved in a battleship. And then you have the shells, the thousands of them. And then on top of that, once you've got all that manufacture, etc., you've got the fact that that can be easily overwritten by events. Suddenly your guns are no good, or your shells are no good. And you've got all that weight and all that expense again. For a nation which is on the infrastructure poverty side, amongst its peers, that is a weakness. Aircraft carriers, well, you want to change the aircraft, you just hope you have big enough lifts and hangars. You want to change the weapons those aircraft use? Well, because they're going to be carried by aircraft, those weapons are going to be a lot lighter, a lot smaller, and a lot easier to move around than ship shells are. They really are. They're going to be a lot easier to maneuver. And a lot easier to manufacture. And this is something which takes time to understand and truly develop. And yes, there are examples of the Japanese literally using converted ship shells as their weapons in World War II to be dropped from aircraft. But to be honest, that shows the advantage again of a carrier. You try and put those shells in a gun which isn't designed for them. That's a massive modification process. You change them into a bomb for a dive. That's actually a fairly easy process, and a lot less demanding on your infrastructure and industry. However, what you've seen with both this carrier and the Langley, both Hōshō and Langley, you've seen strike carriers. You've just seen fleet carriers being developed. Because, to many ways, the Japanese are forced by their size to focus on warfighting capability. In terms of, I would say, the Mahanian emphasis. I wouldn't say Mahanian, because there is always an idea that Mahan just focuses in on warfighting and on the battles, but actually no, he does have a lot of the other side of deterrence and the wider conflict and being able to use conflict. He emphasizes the learning about the battles because he's trying to demonstrate, especially to the American political class, the value of having the battle fleet, because the battle fleet is what allows you to do all that. When we're talking about Corbett, we're talking about someone who emphasizes what you can do with the battle fleet and what a battle fleet allows you to do, because he's talking to a political class which already has a battle fleet. So one side is justifying covering those writings, but also justifying the creation of a battle fleet, and the other one is justifying the retention and the utility of a battle fleet. Both the Japanese and the Americans, in terms of their aircraft carriers, are actually pushing more the Mahanian focus, because I think to an extent they're going through that same process of justifying the existence of aircraft carriers. Which is what makes the British scenario, considering already the formation of the RAF, so interesting with HMS Hermes. Because she is very different. From the get-go, she is far more of a Corbettian construct. Far more of a pursuit of, this is a vessel about presence. This is a vessel about operating around the world. From her ability to function with seaplanes and the facilities she has, especially on her stone deck, which can be easily seen here, to bring seaplanes aboard, to fix them, maintain them, and work with them. As well as conventional carrier aircraft, the large crane, and all these things that are part of her, are part of her operation of being a global base for aviation. The Royal Navy is already, when looking at this ship and building the ship, thinking about what her utility is, not as a primary vehicle for war, as in fighting the enemy fleet, but as a vehicle for war, for commerce warfare, for reconnaissance, for conflict management, for deterrence in peacetime, presence, and probably quite heavily also as something to gain experience of operations and operational knowledge and experience. And this is going to be a feature of her entire career, because she is often deployed the furthest away from the UK. In fact, here we have a classic and really good picture of her, and guess where it's taken? Where are you thinking? You're thinking it's Singapore? Maybe it's Portsmouth? All those places? No, it's taken in Honolulu. It's in Hawaii. The Royal Navy's aircraft carrier, their first purpose-built aircraft carrier, and one of her first big operations. She's off in the China station, she's off doing those things. She actually goes out and is in Hawaii. On Hawaii, she doesn't arrive in Hong Kong till 1925. In that time, she's already visited Hawaii. Why? Because she's about showing the world the British capability and what their modern carrier looks like, but also she's about far more than war fighting. Just fighting a war would be simple. The Royal Navy can justify that. They have fleets to justify that. They will have carriers aplenty for that role. But carriers for her role, trade protection, cruiser support in distant waters, that's going to be something else. That's going to be far more difficult to justify. Because again, that is something you can't point to. You can point to a battle fleet, you can point to a carrier with a fleet and go, there, that's to kill the enemy. And that's a really easy sell in military capabilities. But saying, yeah, that ship, that's so we have presence in distant waters to hopefully never have to fight the enemy, because it'll hopefully deter them from sending surface raiders into those waters and damaging trade. So hopefully we don't have to do a full convoy system and send all, and actually run a whole convoy system in distant waters, far away from the key points of war, so we don't have to send resources to that role. That's a lot of we hopes, and this should work in theory based on this. It does work. She's part of it. But still, it's far more difficult to sell that than a fighting capability. So let's see how that affects her air group. Well, for starters, you have to remember her air group is 20 aircraft. The Hōshō has an air group of roughly 15. The Langley has an air group of 36. And even then, I would say those are variable, because what they're doing with their aircraft, what they're likely to do, will affect what aircraft they're actually carrying and how many they're actually carrying. In the case of Langley, it's usually 18 torpedo bombers and 18 fighters, and that's a good mix. That's a good starting point, let's be honest. That, in Royal Navy terms, turns out to be the ideal figures. They really like those ideas as the base point for a carrier, and then you build up for your air group depending on what it wants to do and what else you want to do with it. But that's the US Navy finding that with Langley first time and going, this is good. This allows us to maintain a cap. This is great. This allows us to maintain a strike. We'd like more of this. That makes them happy. With the Hermes, though, she's not that. She's 20 aircraft. She's 20 aircraft. And you have to remember, at this point, the Royal Navy is restricted by the structure of the Fleet Air Arm being part of the Royal Air Force and under the administration of the Air Ministry, despite the Admiralty paying the bill for it and being under the operational control of the Admiralty, but to an extent the strategic control of the Air Ministry because of the various arguments. They have downgraded Fleet Air Arm Organisation from being squadrons, which the Royal Naval Air Service had always been in, to being flights. And so when they're looking at 20 aircraft capacity, that's about 3 flights of 6 aircraft. And maybe you have a slightly bigger flight. Maybe you have a bonus couple of aircraft on there. They start off with the Flycatcher. That's the fighter. That's what's providing the operational capability in terms of air defense, and also the anti-scout capability. Because what you have to consider for this vessel, it was a reconnaissance asset and it was an anti-reconnaissance asset. It was not a strike-emphasized asset. It was a presence, we're going to know what's going on in this area asset. It was a capability to really project presence, and that's where the next thing came out, the Fairy 3D. Now that's actually a Fairy 3F, but the only picture I can find of a 3D is one with floats on that looks honestly like the cameraman is drunk, and it's grainy as anything and doesn't really give you an outline of the aircraft. So I hope you don't mind indulging me here with a picture of a Fairy 3F. I think it looks cute, and it does emphasize some of the things I've already been mentioning. This picture was taken aboard HMS Furious. You can see, I think it's the Rock of Gibraltar in the background. It does look like the Rock of Gibraltar in the background. And honestly, you can see what I mean about the air crew and the fitters, etc., wandering around barehanded to grab the aircraft. you can even see some of the things on the deck as well. Now, this aircraft is one of the longest lasting aircraft in Fleet Air Arm service. The Fairey 3 has its first flight in September 1917. It only really serves with the Royal Air Force and the Fleet Air Arm, although it does serve with pretty much the entirety of the Fleet Air Arm and the Royal Air Force, i.e. it does a lot of work with the Australians, it does work with, it even gets into service with the Irish at one point, and New Zealanders, and it's taken a trial by a lot of other navies and air forces as well to try and see what they're like. It is a reconnaissance aircraft. It is a spotter reconnaissance aircraft. It is there to find the threat and better track your engagement of that threat. There are 964 of these aircraft built. That's your first clue about there being something different going on. When I talked about the Douglas DT, I mentioned there were 90 of those built. The Vought V7 had 128 built. The Japanese aircraft, well, if you're talking about the Mitsubishi 1MF, that has 138 built. 138 built. If you're talking about the lovely B1M, that's 443. Again, doing far better than most of the others. But the out-and-out winner of the aircraft construction race is the Fairey 3D. 964. Very nearly 1,000 aircraft produced. And it's prolific because it goes through many generations, and each one of these are useful. But the purpose of it truly is information warfare. And the fact that it forms the core and the majority of Hermes Air Group shows really what her purpose is. She's about information. She's about presence, but she's mostly about information. And there is a reason for this. And there's a reason why the others are about strike. Oh, sorry. Not this one. This is a map of the world's undersea cables, which you can overlay with a map of the world's oversea trade links and see some very interesting connections between choke points and the fact that modern choke points are not just potentially trade choke points, but also data choke points. Yes, we don't think about the internet being a physical thing, but there is the physical embodiment of the internet. All those cables. That's it. And cutting it can cause trouble. But here is the real one. Okay. Reasons for differences. This is the trade map. Now, the Royal Navy produces many of these throughout the 1920s and 30s. It's something they keep a constant tally of. Where ships are in the world, what merchant trade routes are like. And these dots represent large ships. They represent ships which are considered strategically of value in the merchant marine. So, these dots are literally just the big ones. There are thousands more smaller ones wandering around, usually sometimes on the same routes. And the Royal Navy's view is they have to protect and control all of this in the home fleet area, through the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, into the Far East. But if you notice, if you consider where the British are basing and focusing their forces, you start to realize, well, hang on, the heavy routes are going through the Mediterranean and the home fleet areas. So, yeah, that's where you concentrate your forces. But there's a lot of exposure out around the world. And that's where ships like Hermes come in, and Argus. That's where their presence matters. But if you're talking about America and Japan in this period, when they're putting the strategic analysis, are they worrying about deploying forces to the Indian Ocean? Do they have to have a presence there to deter pirates? Or can they rely on the British to do it because the British have to? Are they looking at maybe the coast of Africa from the same perspective? The Americans are probably thinking about South America, but let's be honest, there have been periods at this point in living memory where the navies of Brazil, Argentina, and Chile were more powerful than the US Navy. They're still at this point benefiting from some of the capabilities they acquired in their own South American dreadnought race. And we're talking not bad ships here. There is a reason the Americans do consider trying to acquire the Chilean dreadnought at the end when after Pearl Harbor because of their shortage of ships. And it's not because they have a fascination for having big ships with big guns. So, this is the world. If you're America and Japan, and for Japan especially at this point, there are two big threats to their existence. The two things they've had to fight for their existence, in their mind especially, are Russia, which they've engaged in repeated wars in Asia in Korea, in Asia, and all sorts of parts of China. They have engaged in war fighting with them. And America, who were the power who forced them open. Yes, if we look at history, you can realize the British were not far behind the idea of what would eventually lead to a similar deployment as Commodore Perry and various other things, but they didn't get there first. Commodore Perry arrived first. Commodore Perry became the bad guy. The British came afterwards, and they managed to get modelled as the good guy, because they're there to protect and help you. Oh yeah, they're here to trade, as you've been cruelly opened up, and we're here. Would you like some equipment? And would you maybe like some ships which can prevent a lot of that happening to you again? Would you? Would you like it? And yes, that isn't an fully accurate telling of events. Yes, there is all sorts of nuance and context around those events, but that was the narrative. That was the strategic narrative going through their heads. So they're looking at it, okay, we are between these two massive powers. Yes, we've handily beaten the Russians. We haven't, but in our past, we've had this from the Americans, this treatment, and the Russians could always come back. So they are always concentrating on dominating the Pacific and their area of the Pacific. So their strategic discussion and debate is literally that area of the Pacific. That's what they're thinking about. This is one of the reasons why when World War II does happen and they get as far down as Singapore and they get Rangoon and they get all these areas and the Indian Ocean, they do barely anything with. They get control of access to the Indian Ocean and they do Operation Sea. That's it. Operation Sea is, for them, I would say, a strategic success. They go in, they sink a few things, they cause a lot of trouble for the British, and they cause the British to become very, very strategically defensive in their approach of deploying forces to the Eastern Fleet. But they don't do anything with it. And yes, you can say, well, they don't do anything because the Americans are attracting their attention. True. But at no point did they have any plans for doing anything with it either. Not realistically. They're all things which they come to lately because, to be honest, their concept of operations haven't extended that far. If you're the Americans, what are you thinking about? Well, you're thinking about the Pacific. Go west. That's your lake. That's your ocean. The Atlantic is something you have to share the British. And I know people like to talk and play up the idea of a Anglo-American war after World War One. You know, oh, if there's a naval race goes on, there could be war between the two. There would be war. Why? What's going to start the war? The war between Britain and Germany doesn't start because of a naval race. Yes, they're in an alliance system because of the naval race, which Germany had started, but the war doesn't start because of the naval race. So, first of all, for them to end up in a war, you have to have a reason for the war to start. Is it going to be an American invasion of Canada? Is it going to be a British invasion of America? Does either of those things look likely? Historically, reading through the 1920s and 30s, the actual literature, actual speeches, and actual publications of the governments, let alone the sheer number of communications and conversations going on, and the sheer level, the vast quantity of connections. No? Then war's not likely. Wars don't happen because of naval races. No one starts a war because of a naval race. They contribute to the alliance structure because they contribute to an atmosphere of fear, and then alliances and things can do it, but there again, the Anglo-American naval race was always a qualitative one, not a quantitative one. Yes, the Americans were building a load of 16-inch gun ships. That was in response to the fact the British had a load of 15-inch gun ships. Yes, the British were building 16.5-inch gun G3s and the 18-inch N3s. Yeah, the Americans would have responded likewise. If they responded at all, it's going to depend on the mood of Congress. They've had some people who've been very pro-Navy for the previous decade or so. They were about due for some period people who were very anti-Navy. And qualitative naval races had been going on for a long, long time. If you think about it, the Royal Navy had a whole qualitative naval race going on with the French back in the 1860s. They had it going on with them in the 1840s. There is a constant qualitative naval race that has to be differentiated from the quantitative naval race. And it's quantitative ones, i.e. when we're building our quantity versus you, so we have more than you, or we have enough you can't attack us, that's when you start to add edge into it. And that's when you start to add fear, and that's when you start to add alliances, and once you add alliances, you have a lot of other complications that come in. And that is why you set up Europe in the scenario it is in World War I, where it only takes one spark, one small issue, and a whole lot of miscalculations on the part of a whole lot of governments for war to break out. It's not the naval race. The naval race is not a cause. It's a symptom and a contributor, but it's not a cause. There is a difference. And again, there's a difference to the Americans here, because what are you using your fleet for? If you're not using your ships and your carriers for security of all this maritime expanse, if you are not doing all this, and this is actually a really good question to ask today, because America is the #1 power. They have taken over the British maritime policeman role. You concentrate on a battle fleet if you don't have that role. If you have that role, you both have to have a battle fleet and the patrol fleet. I've explained before that the naval treaties put Italy and France, or put France specifically in a bind, because they have different commitments than the Italians. They have a different geostrategic situation, and they are combined to them in size. It's the same for the British. The British would not have built a battle fleet bigger than the Americans. They wouldn't. They're not in that scenario with them, and they don't need to. But the real problem for Britain is that the cumulative limits on carriers, on cruisers, carriers in the Washington Treaty, on cruisers in the London Treaties, really hamper their ability to protect this empire. Really hampered their ability to protect this trade. That's the reason why they push for the 6-inch cruisers versus the extra tonnage for 6-inch cruisers versus 8-inch cruisers, because they can get more units, but they're still short of them for doing all their duties they need to do. And that's where vessels like Hermes come in. They're about maximizing that, but you also have a cumulative tonnage limit on the number of those vessels you can have. And that's only taken off in the Second London Naval Treaty, and by then it's too late to surge build them. And again, we go back to that discussion, a thing I mentioned earlier. Under the first Washington Naval Treaty, first Washington Naval Treaty, the first naval treaty, there is no cumulative limit on ships below 10,000 tons, which is due to the Hawkins class and cruisers. You can build as many of them as you like. If Britain had gone with the larger design of aircraft, of cruiser, that limit would probably be about 15,000 tons. In which case, Hermes, Langley, and Hōshō would all not have been counted towards carrier tonnage at all. They'd have all been far, far too small. Langley's only 12, nearly 13,000 tons standard. Hermes, you've got to love her. She's just around 11,000 tons in standard. And as I mentioned, Hōshō is teeny. She is 7,600 tons, well, 590 tons in standard. She's tiny. These ships just wouldn't have counted under those circumstances. And whilst I don't think either America or Japan would have suddenly built a whole swarm of smaller carriers, let's be honest, whilst the Japanese try with Ryūjō, they're trying to build a very big carrier on a small carrier hull, and it doesn't work. I think the British would have. I think the British would have quite happily, probably their fleet carriers, I'm not sure if they'd have actually built any more. They probably would have built something more. If you've got Argus and Hermes both not counting towards your tonnage, you've got enough spare tonnage, they might well have built a carrier earlier. There were funding issues, yes, but there was also one of the troubles with getting the funding issues at the time and justifying the funding was the size of the carrier available and what you wanted to do with the carrier. What kind of mission was it profiled for? I think if they'd been building more Hermes, and they could have done, I think you would have probably seen the Royal Navy go with a policy of, for every 5, 6 cruisers they order, they'd have ordered a Hermes class or something similar to that, to maximize their presence around the world and their capability. It would have led to a lot of interesting discussions come the London Naval Treaties and a lot of interesting definitions to have to be drawn up. I presume you'd have ended up rather like the cruiser structure with a light carrier structure put in there, and then who knows what the Americans and Japanese would have done in response to that. But the thing is, it's the cumulative limit which really causes the British the problems. Because it means they need carriers for this mission. They need Hermes-style carriers to go out and be the present ships, to be the aviation assets in the South Atlantic. They need them to be the present assets in the East China Sea. They need them in the Indian Ocean. They need them doing those missions so their fleet carriers can concentrate on the same roles which the American and Japanese carriers are focusing on. And they can't. So they keep trying to square the circle. They keep trying to do that. And that's an ongoing saga we'll be covering as the 20s and 30s unfold. But realistically, for all these ships, and I'm finishing on this map for a reason, for all these ships, they are a product, and probably the purest product, of their strategic scenario. Prior to the treaties muddle up things. They add a whole other layer of context and nuance and restrictions above the strategic nature and issues of the nations involved. But when these three carriers are being ordered and created, they represent the strategic interests of the nations they are built for. They represent what they're trying to do. They represent what they need. For the Japanese, it's an edge. For the Americans, it's understanding. How are we going to employ this? How is this going to affect us? And for the British, it's presence and security. I've often pointed out that a lot of the ships being constructed at the end of World War One for the Royal Navy are more about fighting the next war than they are about the war they're in. I'd argue Hermes and her completion is more about the security of peacetime and not repeating the experience of World War One vis-a-vis surface raiders and the subsurface threat than anything else. Anyway, thank you for watching. I've asked the question before, what happens if the British, or there is some part of the treaty which allows building of these smaller carriers, and they do keep churning them out? I'm going to ask this question. How much does the world change if the British go for the larger Hawkins design, potential Hawkins design? Now, for that, I need to explain that potential design. When Denicourt, the naval, director of naval construction time, was putting together the designs for the Hawkins and options, he was working with various ones for up to 10,000 tons. And they had 6, 7.5 inch and 9.2 inch guns. The trouble is, it was found that whilst they could design a hull for 30 knots, and this was in June 1915, they couldn't get enough 9.2 inch guns on that hull. And they didn't feel the 6 inch had enough stopping power, so they went with 7.5 inch. And that's literally the decision made. But there were also discussions around the time of what could you do if you increase the tonnage. Now, at this point, the British are experimenting with triple turrets. And some of the design discussions refer to a triple 9.2 inch turret design. You're looking at something which is roughly 15,000 tons. I would say that's 15,000 tons in standard, roughly. And it's roughly 4 triple 9.2 inch guns. Now, I have seen drawings put together by people based on their reading of the papers, but I haven't ever seen actual drawings for the design myself. And these were discussions. The main problem that had been earlier in the war about getting these ships had been Winston Churchill, who always has a lovely idea of things, and he had objected to the first generation designs that had been put forward in 1913 because they didn't feel they were fast enough and they cost too much, and he felt smaller and faster ships were better. With his vaunted naval experience, he felt smaller and faster ships were better. Had huge arguments with Admiral Battenberg, the first Sea Lord at the time, over it. But as it was, war occurred and everyone put the designs and ideas to the background, and it's only in June 1915 they really get them out. This is after Denicourt has, in October 1914, been arguing again for what he was calling his Atlantic cruiser. The idea was it would have a large radius of operations. All of this sort of features into and eventually gets a discussion which leads to, in many ways, the compromised design being chosen, because the tonnage limitation has been placed on them, again artificially, by Churchill, insisting that he wanted smaller ships. And they had to be smaller ships. Even though they'd grown since the original design, they still had to be smaller ships. And the 7.5 inch guns. Because, well, originally he'd wanted 6 inches, and you can see where the compromises come from. 9.2 inch gun design had been preferred. So in this scenario, the Royal Navy gets their 9.2 inch gun design. And they build them. That's the easiest way, really, to see to you getting a Washington Naval Treaty which has a roughly 15,000 standard ton limit of anything built under that doesn't count towards carriers, doesn't count towards capital ships, doesn't count towards anything. And using that as the base point, and a world where that is the scenario, so honestly, I can't imagine the Germans and the Japanese are not going to build their counterparts, or the French, or the Italians. The Germans are probably still going to be limited to 10,000 tons by the Treaty of Versailles. That's it. It's the Treaty of Versailles that limits them, not the Washington Naval Treaty. So that's going to be a really interesting scenario for eventually any Deutschland to come into the world. If there are a load of 15,000 ton standard ton 12 9.2 inch gun ships wandering around, I think a Deutschland class might need to be a little bit reworked in its idea and framing. But leaving that to one side, with that as the criteria, there's no special permit for carriers, etc. How do you think that nations evolve? How do you think they go for? Considering their strategic scenarios, what do you think happens? Do you think the Japanese try with smaller carriers as well as the Brits? Do you think maybe the Italians and French try with smaller carriers? I can see the French especially considering it because of their empire and their trade requirements. If there's no restrictions on those areas, those are the areas which the imperial powers can build. The Washington Treaty becomes a limit on battle fleet size and force formation. It doesn't become a limit on your ability to police your empire, which it makes it better from both the British and the French perspective. But that has consequences for the Italians, who have less infrastructure than the French. Do they feel they need to match it? And it has consequences for the Japanese and the Americans. Do they feel they need to build these ships? Do they need to feel they need to do them? Let's be honest. The Americans do build the Ranger, and you've got to love her. She is 14,810 tons in standard. So technically, she's trying to build a ship under 15,000 tons. Again, Ranger would become... Would that affect? How would that affect Ranger if she's not a fleet carrier? Would she be perhaps better because she wouldn't be designed as a fleet carrier? She'd be designed as what everyone else is building as ships underneath as a response to them, or is she still decided as the Americans trying to get a fleet carrier? Is it the Japanese and the Americans pushing their own way to get these fleet carriers underneath 15,000 tons and having a little race in that scenario, while the British are merrily building, and the French are merrily building presence carriers, which are designed to be these solo operating ships, these mobile naval aviation bases around that are operating areas around the world and provide the aviation for that area. It's not as if that's without precedent. You know, you've got the tribal class destroyers, my own classic example from my shameless book plug earlier, of the British going their own way. And to be honest, with all of them, you can point to ways they could be going their own way. I know. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please do like. Maybe consider sharing and subscribing. It's really, really helpful. This has always been a passion project. This channel has always been a passion project for me. It certainly wouldn't work out as sensible if I did a time and motion cost study. But history rarely does. So for that makes all the support this channel receives really, really important. And thank you. Because it's thanks to your support I get the books and you've been able to do all this. I don't know. Hope you enjoyed today's video. And well, what have we got coming up? Next week we have American World War II Carrier Naval Aviation Doctrine, Pre-War to War. No, I haven't packed the books. I remember, I've got that written, and I have recorded a version, but I recorded a version ages ago and I don't like it anymore. So, yeah, that's going to get re-recorded, and I haven't closed up the books, so... Phew. They're not away in boxes. All the Norman Freeman books are out, and ready to go. Thank you very much for watching, take care, and thank you.